All right, welcome or welcome back if you're joining us from our prior sessions. We are going to close day three with a session focused on operational and financial improvement areas that consistently have the greatest impact on rural hospital performance. So, for many critical access hospitals, financial pressure builds gradually through operational inefficiencies, reimbursement gaps, underperforming service lines, and workforce imbalance. The challenges that are often manageable when identified early and addressed strategically. So in this session, Eric Schell is our board chair at Stroudwater, and Dan Gibbon, who's a senior consultant here at Stroudwater, will share practical perspectives on the financial and operational levers that most commonly drive measurable improvement in rural hospitals. Together, they bring extensive experience supporting critical access hospitals through financial turnaround work, operational assessments, reimbursement strategy, and long-term sustainability planning. This discussion will focus on practical areas where hospitals can strengthen margins, stabilize operations, improve reimbursement performance, and better align leadership around long-term organizational priorities. So that please, there's a Q&A function in Zoom. It's on the bottom. If you can't see it, it's usually behind the little the three dots where it says more. Please post questions that you might have during the presentation there. We're going to they'll be answered by the presenters either at the end of the session or they will follow up with you afterwards. So with that, I want to introduce Eric and Dan.
Thanks, Keith.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon to many. Good morning to some. And let's get this thing going. So the source of this presentation is for the last probably almost 29 years that I've had a chance personally to travel around and probably visit 400 rural hospitals. And probably Dan is at least 70 or 80 rural hospitals in his 8 years of being with us. And so when we went into a rural hospital, we kind of are looking for certain things, and we consider them best practices. And what this presentation is a collection of all of the best practices that, frankly, we are looking for when we sit down to work with a hospital when we're on site. And so and then as we write our reports, often we call these strategic financial operational assessments. Our reports become all of the opportunities where a hospital has opportunities to improve in a certain area relative to best practices. And so that's the basis of this talk. And frankly, it's everything that we look for in helping rural hospitals. And so you will get a copy of this presentation, steal, take, cheat, whatever we got to do, or borrow. But this presentation is loaded with stuff. So at the highest level within an organization, and many of you who know me and have heard me speak before know that one of the key pieces of what I look for is this abundance mindset. But there's three, and as we've traveled around, these three areas are the one thing consistent in the highest performing of rural hospitals that we've worked with. And the first is this abundance and / infinite gain mindset. And to me, that one, if we have that at the leadership position, that's 50% of getting the rest right. The second is a fundamental understanding of hospital economics, and fundamental to the point where every decision we make and how we think about our service lines and profit are all with this ingrained sense of economics. And then the third is a measurement culture, and in the spirit of if you manage what you measure. And the inverse of that, does the inverse mean you don't manage what you don't measure? And I've got some thoughts on that. So we want to kick off this presentation kind of highlighting these three aspects of hospital performance that we look for when we visit. So what is this abundance mindset and what is this infinite gain mindset? I look at them as the same coin, different sides of the same coin. So because this is 50% of getting it right, I'm going to read a little bit from Stephen Covey and his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And because, boy, this is right. He said, the abundance mentality, the paradigm that there is plenty out there for everybody. And then he contrasts that to the scarcity in his writing. He said, most people are deeply scripted in what I call a scarcity mentality. They see life as only having so much, as though there was only one pie out there. And if Dan was successful, he would take from my pie. I'm not going to let Dan take from my pie. And so what do I do? I have a very difficult time sharing recognition and credit, power or profit, even with those who help in the production. Um, it's almost like something's being taken away when someone else receives special recognition or windfall gain. Although they might verbally express happiness for others' success, inwardly they're eating their hearts out. Their sense of worth comes from being compared, and someone else's success to some degree means their failure. Uh, so this is the essence, and it's in the original, 35-year-old book, Seven Habits. And then he turns around and he goes on about 6 paragraphs talking about scarcity, and then he says the abundance mentality, on the other hand, flows out of a deep inner sense of personal worth and security. It is the paradigm that there is plenty out there and enough to spare for everybody. It results in sharing of prestige, of recognition, of profits, of decision making. It opens possibilities, options, alternatives, creativity. It is so much the key to the kingdom. Um, the infinite game. So this is something that Simon Sinek came out with in his book, The Infinite Game. But the mindset is so essentially what Simon argues in this book is that we live in a very finite, people are looking at finite performance, performance over a month, a quarter, a year, and where in essence business lives in the infinite. In other words, there's no known players. You have competition, but you don't know all of them. There's no defined period of performance. And what he argues is in the infinite mindset that our goal in an organization is to perpetuate the organization to achieve its mission, its goals. And the issue here and why this ties back to abundance is that he talks about adopting this infinite mindset in a world consumed by the finite, and it can absolutely cost a leader their job. The pressure I'm reading now from the last chapter in his book, The Infinite Game. The pressure we all face today to maintain a finite mindset is overwhelming. For most of us, almost any kind of career opportunities we have are almost all tied to how we perform in the finite game. We falsely tie our own value or self-worth to how we perform in the finite game. And any hopes we may have to anything other than play with a finite mindset seem completely dashed. Bowing to the pressure of finite players around us is the easy and expedient choice. This is why it takes a courage to adopt an infinite mindset. And so these are very similar things. And what happens often is the more the infinite gain mindset or the abundance mindset that we have, the more likely those leaders are going to get taken out on their way up through the organization or even at the top of an organization. Some of my best friends, who I consider off the charts abundance, have all been taken out through various plays. And frankly, because again, it's this finite world that we play in, and most people judge based on finite. So when leaders, and I would say 85% of leaders in rural healthcare organizations are either um, have this finite or scarcity mindset, or on a spectrum of being on there. Very few are abundance minded because of this getting taken out of the way. I spent a lot of time talking about this because when we find that abundance leader, I have seen organizations turn around in 6 months, because what happens is instead of focusing on expenses, there's a focus on growth and opportunity rather than restriction. So a lot said there, really important topic. Boy, it's something very passionate to me. The next area is fundamental understanding of economics and understanding contribution margin. So yeah, here you guys are saying, oh, you got 2 accountants up here talking about contribution margin, sign us down. Um, but understanding that contribution margin is revenue less the variable expenses of producing that piece, that source of revenue. And if we think about it in our organizations, if we admit one more patient tonight, if we have one more patient in our clinic, the revenue is fairly easy to find. We'll get paid $2,500 a day. We're going to get $250 in our rural health clinic. But the variable piece, which is necessary to calculate contribution margin, is very difficult. And often, if you close your eyes and you think about it, we admit one more patient in our hospital tonight. How much did our cost change? What was the variable cost? I would argue for the most part, it was food and drugs and maybe a little bit of electricity, right? And so there's significant contribution margin associated with incremental volume. And so, a lot of words here to essentially say the key to success within our rural hospitals is creating thousands and thousands of mini contribution margins to cover the fixed expenses of an organization. We had a study, the University of Iowa School of Public Health, Keith Mueller and his team put together this study last January that looked at kind of this question of, so in our hospitals, how much of our expenses are truly variable, right? This contribution margins, revenue less variable expenses. So nobody's ever really looked at this. And so what Keith Mueller and his team at the University of Iowa did is they studied 10 years worth of cost reports for 5,000 hospitals and looked at when volume changes, what did the cost change? And they called it the simple method. And what they determined on my pointer, I'm going to point to this middle column here in this graph, or not graph, but this chart here. And what this shows is think of this as the first row is big hospital, medium hospital, small hospital, very small hospital as we go down the rows. The middle column is the percent on average of fixed costs, the inverse being variable. And what it showed is that the smaller the hospital, the higher the percent of fixed costs. So if we just look at many of our critical access hospitals, I would put in this category here. And it showed that on average, 90% of our costs are fixed, meaning that variable expenses, when we change volume, are 10 cents on the dollar. When we combine that fundamental understanding with the abundance mindset, the direction is clear. It's about one more. It's about one more visit. It's about one more admission, one more swing bet. And those are the keys to the kingdom. I was in Washington, D.C. yesterday for a Rural Hospital Issues Group meeting, and a lot of folks were talking about all of the things that were negatively impacting us, the HR1 and the impacts of reduced Medicaid reduced Medicaid coverage, and all of these things that were coming after us. And I made the comment that we have one weapon in our bag, and that one weapon, that one club that we have, is contribution margin on a 90% fixed cost basis. And so it's super important that if everybody walks away with that understanding, there's a focus on growth. And so this slide is really saying, if we're looking at the checklist, let's have everyone walk out of here fundamentally understanding the difference between variable costs, fixed costs, and fully allocated costs. And let me say one more thing, and then we'll move on quickly here because we got a lot to talk about today. Our financial statements will not give us variable costs. I promise you, they will not give it. And the reason why that is our financial statements don't know the time frame for decision making involved in determining variable costs. So now you're scratching your head and you're saying, what are you talking about? And what I'm saying is that if you look at it, if it's a spot market decision, do we admit a patient today? And what is the incremental variable expenses? It's small, it's tiny, it's 10 cents on the dollar. On a spot market planning horizon, on a 5-year planning horizon, 100% of costs are variable. You close the hospital. And in the medium term, do we maintain our obstetric service or lab service or something like that? The variable cost just became the entire cost of that service line. But our financial statements will not give us variable costs because they don't know the time frame for our decision making. And so to some degree, we have to kind of take a guess at this. So recognizing that all paying services create positive contribution margin. And then this imperative to develop thousands of mini contribution margins. And so, that's kind of the checklist on hospital economics. The third key to success in the most successful hospitals is a measurement culture, taking politics out of decision making with information. And kind of organizational theory ultimately says that there's a three-legged stool out there. The first leg of the stool is decision rights. Where do we set decision rights in an organization? The theory is that the more sophisticated it is to transfer data up to central decision making versus localized decision making, the more we should decentralize. And so in hospitals, I would argue that our frontline managers are making decisions every day that we can't transmit up to have a centralized decision maker call those shots. We've got to make those shots. We got to call those shots in balls. So we have to decentralize decision making. If that's the case, then we got to tweak the two other legs of the stool, compensation. So if we give somebody 100% decision making and then pay them on a flat salary, there's a very high likelihood that there's just going to be an underperformance there. So compensation has to be tweaked to reward performance in line with organizational goals. So more merit-based compensation when we decentralize decision rights. So now we've tweaked two legs of this three-legged stool. The third is measurement. There's two levels of measurement. One, we have to increase measurement to push down to the decision makers so that they can see the impact on the decisions that they're making. The other is we have to pull information up to the senior leaders to make sure that what's going on down in the bowels is in line with organizational strategy. And so this idea of organizational architecture in our hospitals that are very complex organizations that decision making is pushed down require a level of measurement that goes way beyond, we have to think about ways of creating sophisticated measurement systems. I will suggest to you as we go through the rest of this presentation that all of our bulleted recommendations that we look for are couched in one of these, in one of these three: measurement, economics, and abundance/infinite mindset. So with that, here are the areas, and we're going to let Dan talk here in just a minute. So if you're getting tired of me, that we'll hold off. So here are the areas that we tend to pay attention to when we're looking to at kind of our traditional strategic financial operational assessment. And we're going to touch on each of these today to the extent we have time to do so. The first is strategy, and not sure how many of you participated in. I gave my Shaky Bridge talk on Tuesday afternoon, and in essence, what I'll sum this whole piece up by saying that the payment system that we live in today is evolving slowly. If form follows function follows payment, right? We organize ourselves around the functional imperatives of a payment system. And the payment system right now under fee-for-sick care is the functional imperatives are maximizing price, maximizing volume, and minimizing expenses. The function, the form that came out of that, frankly, were independent organizations competing with each other on market share. As payment evolves to more accountable care payment systems, the functional imperatives are evolving to something that is much more aggregating. So we've got to offer a full kind of healthcare, sick care resources to a population, an aggregation of services. We have to have enough lives to diversify insurance risk, an aggregation of lives. And so the payment systems of the future have very different functional imperatives and form. So if payment is evolving and is no longer constant, and payment affects what we do and how we look in doing it, then payment really has to be a part of our organizational strategy. And organizations that understand this and understand that we have to, as payment evolves, we have to transform our delivery system. We have to create a healthcare system because fundamentally we don't have one. We don't get paid for healthcare. And we got to pick up and move payment is really important. And strategic planning, I would suggest, has gotten much more complicated than it was when a payment system was constant. I'm going to hold off any more. If you're interested in that my whole Shaky Bridge talk, it featured this how we think about this was it's copied. It's on our website now from Tuesday's showing. So, but strategy has gotten complicated, and it takes an alignment of delivery system, payment system, and health system as payment evolves. So now we're going to get into, when we roll up our sleeves and we sit down and start interviewing folks and kind of talking about, kind of what is it that we're looking for? What's our best practices? And when we compare what's going on in the hospitals to these best practices, that's often where opportunities are flagged, identified, and frankly quantified. So I know, Dan, you wanted to touch on some of these.
Yeah,
Why don't we hear what you have to say?
absolutely. Sure. Thanks, Eric. So this is really the meat and potatoes, and we'll talk a little bit about, what we are looking for when actually we look at this before we even go on site for an inpatient unit. So, one of the things that we really look for to see how our acute care unit is performing is the percentage of admissions and observation stays over your ER visits, that percentage. And best practice rural hospitals are usually in that 10 to 12% mark. Sometimes it's a little bit more if you have 24/7 general surgery, say. Sometimes it might be a hair less, but ideally you'd love to be in that 10 to 12% mark range of your acute admissions and observation stays as a percent of your ED visits. Now, if you're not in that range, what are some best practices to implement to try to improve that percentage? Sometimes I've seen hospitals down as low as like 5% or 6%. So if that's the case, what we always say is you really need to define your care spectrum. And what does that really mean? It is taking a look at your capabilities at your facility. Realistically, what are the types of patients that you can care for? And do this in a collaborative fashion where you're including your medical staff, your nursing staff, pharmacy, analyzing your equipment, making sure it's up to date, talking to your different therapists to make sure that you create as large a spectrum as possible to be able to accommodate those patients and increase that percentage. So,
The other thing, Dan, as it relates to that is, one of the things I like to do is just get back to this measurement, right? If you have often what you'll find is if you are, say, in Dan's example, 6% admission rate, and we think you should be closer to 10 to 12, if you sit down with your ER physicians on a monthly basis and review, you'll often have one ER physicians in the 4% and then a couple in the 10 to 12%. And sitting down having conversations, using data to kind of inform what's going on. So monthly reviews of your ER admissions by ER physician and hospitalists as well.
absolutely. And then, the next thing is particularly with, smaller facilities that maybe don't have the personnel or feel that they have enough personnel, you'll find that the observation stays really start to increase as a percentage of overall admissions. And, when we see it up above 30%, we flag it. That's a sign to us that the observation stays are too high and we need to either A, try to fully admit those patients, or we're getting denials and they need to be fought. And so that's a quick way to try to focus on getting that full inpatient stay versus an observation if your observation stays are exceeding 30% of your total admits. Swing bed. Particularly for critical access hospitals, this is a really important aspect. Just ties back right into what Eric was saying. We want to create thousands of mini contribution margins. Swing bed, the way it functions on a critical access hospital cost report, really helps offset a lot of overhead. But oftentimes, what we're seeing more and more is you have to be proactive in your pursuit of swing bed patients. And this is regularly reaching out to your referral sources, talking to them about the capabilities, educating providers, things of that nature to make sure that when there is an opportunity, you're able to seize it and bring that swing bed patient to your facility. It also includes streamlining that process, making sure that the patient is the right fit and getting that referring facility an answer back quickly.
Two of the opportunities that I see it with the swing bed is what I've found is it's one of the most manageable service lines in a hospital. You put a strategically significant spotlight on swing bed, the census grows. As soon as you take that spotlight off of the swing bed census, it shrinks. And so the key for our leadership teams is to maintain a constant, almost setting swing bed census as a KPI within our organizations, and we pay attention to it. The other thing, the second item is just the easy button. Our organization has to be the easy button for referrals from larger systems. And as soon as we are not the easy button, the volume's going to dry up. And so let's make sure again that we are capturing as much volume as we can by being available and accessible to these larger systems.
Be the path of least resistance.
Yeah, easy button.
So this next slide talking about tracking KPIs. Did we skip one, Eric? I'm sorry.
No.
We go back. All right. No. Okay. So this next slide, just talking about tracking and monitoring different KPIs in the emergency department. Eric kind of touched on this a little bit earlier there. It's really important to track both admissions and transfers by provider, by ED provider, to look for outliers and address that. Sometimes we've also discovered tracking by the hospitalist, whether the hospitalist or provider is accepting the admission or not. That is a really good clue to what the story is. I've discovered where nurses are actually trying to say, well, we know this provider won't accept this admission based on, a couple years ago, and it's a learned behavior. So sometimes you have to peel the onion back to find the root cause of why we're not getting to that 10 to 12% admission rate over ED visits. Also, one of the things we found with tracking the different KPIs is different times of day, just understanding the behavior of providers and the changes through different times that in the ED can help improve various ED metrics and help you staff more effectively. The next thing, tracking ED standby time for contracted emergency department providers. This is really geared towards critical access hospitals that can report ED standby time on their cost report. If you do have a contracted ED service and they're billing the professional fees, essentially any subsidy that you're paying them can be reported on the cost report, and you can get a portion of that reimbursed through Medicare.
One thing I just want to point out, we didn't highlight it, but this lean process, in our organizations in which emergency room is a repetitive, it's generally a higher volume. There's opportunities for a lean process. I'm friends with a CEO of a hospital that years ago they ran a lean ER process, and I believe they were about 180 minutes of throughput time. And they ran a process, and what they found was that when they were referring stat lab tests to the lab would wait to batch their tests, which added probably another 25 minutes to the patient's stay. After this lean process, they're now down in the kind of, I think the last thing I heard from them, they were under 100 minutes per visit. So significant. So lean process are great. Emergency rooms are great opportunities for lean process and throughput assessment.
All right. This is once again something that we kind of touched on a little bit before, but getting a group together to really examine the transfers or why a patient wasn't admitted, and particularly if you can identify, a true physician champion to help lead this, will help with really just in getting both the inpatient nursing staff, the ED nursing staff, the ED providers, and the hospitalist providers all aligned to really define that care spectrum and make sure we're not missing any opportunities for patients that we could treat locally at our facility.
And then again, we're touching primarily on the bold ones, but there's lots and lots of recommendations here, and frankly, I generally give this as a 4-hour workshop. And I think Dan, you and one of our other colleagues gave it as a 4-hour workshop in Virginia back a couple months ago. So we're just kind of keeping to the facts.
We're trying to distill everything down. Although, as much as we'd love to talk for 4 hours, I'm afraid we might lose a few people. But, when we're talking about, and I've just been going through a budgeting process here at a hospital that I'm interim CFO for. And, one of the amazing things, what we find with, different outpatient managers is there's really two types. And well, I'm fortunate to have a lot of the pitching or the pitchers for managers. And what do we mean by a department manager who's a pitcher? We're talking about a department manager who's always actively identifying opportunities to add another therapy or add new tests to their department.
The one more.
The one more. They are the one more manager. They're out there in the community. They're talking to other parents. They're at sporting events. They always seem to know what we need to add to our hospital to better serve the people in the community. And contrast that with more of a catching manager who is just sitting back, wanting volume to come in. They're not engaging providers or educating providers about the tests and their capabilities within their departments. And what you generally see is that department starts to have a slow decline over time in volume and in utilization. So what we want to do is make sure our managers have that attitude of going out and finding the volume and growing their services. Now, next thing is, and I mean, there's a lot of different recommendations here, but one of the interesting things that I always find is when we're able to get market data and compare what our market share is compared to the entire market. And it's always interesting when you go and you compare, insert any department here. We just had surgical volume and find out, wow, I thought we had more market share, but maybe we're only at 25% or maybe we're only at 15%. Why is it that people are leaving our community, especially if we're the only hospital and game in town, and going elsewhere? And answering those questions, such as are our prices correct? Are we promoting our services properly? Do we have a pitcher as the manager versus a catcher? Um, you know, it's funny when you just go through the budgeting process, you find out how much equipment needs replaced, and it always makes you a little concerned about the spend. But I'll give you one example when it comes to equipment. We have some aging general surgeons that have planned retirement dates, and it turns out in order to recruit any new general surgeons, you're going to have a robot. You need a Da Vinci. So, you do the analysis and you have to show, hey, general surgery, we need it. We're going to have to buck up and spend some money on some CapEx. So just ensuring that you don't fall behind on CapEx is really key, because once you fall too far behind, it's really hard to get caught up.
And Dan, I just had that exact conversation with the CEO of a rural hospital in upstate New York 2 hours ago, that
Yeah.
they've made the decision they cannot recruit general surgeons, and so they've made the decision that they're going to finance a Da Vinci.
People say, hey, we're a critical access hospital. Why do we need a Da Vinci? Well, if you want to have new general surgeons and replace the ones that are retiring, you're going to have to buy one. So next thing is just really evaluate current staffing levels for opportunities. Oftentimes when we think about staffing productivity, the first thing our mind goes to is the expense side. Where are we overstaffed at? But realistically, we have to evaluate the other side of the coin with that abundance mindset and look for departments that are understaffed. And is the reason why they are not growing is because we don't have enough staff there? Do we need to hire another physical therapist if we just added orthopedic surgeons, things of that nature? So we need to make sure that we're looking at both sides of the coin when we look at staffing productivity.
I just want to touch on Dan's the pitcher versus catcher department managers. I think every single one of our hospitals has that one pitcher. It has one. And when we look at the volumes in the pitchers department, they're always constantly going up, as Dan mentioned. And the question I have is if we created an environment in which we added two or three more pitchers, where would we be overall as an organization? And let's see if we can do that. Let's see if we get a couple more pitchers in our departments.
These are a little bit more specific examples, but you know, I'll tell you, just even at the physical therapy department here where I'm at, they grew 30% in 9 months when you have the right person in charge. This is just incredible. And we're getting to a point where we're growing orthopedics and we're starting to see our lead time run out a little bit. So we're planning to hire some more physical therapists. So, when you find a good technique is checking around at your different departments and see what the wait time is to get in. And when you start to see physical therapy at like 8 to 10 weeks, or, quite frankly, even several weeks, it's time to start to think about, do we need more space? Do we need more PTs? How can we reduce that wait time and get evaluations in to PT within 3 days? So we aren't losing that volume. It's not going down the road. It's summer here, and a couple of weeks ago we have an ENT here. We're very lucky. And he had 3 no-shows for his surgical cases, 2 tonsillectomies and another case. And it turns out 2 of the cancellations were the family just were going on vacation. So, reaching out to your patients, especially during these summer months, and making sure that they're going to show up and making sure that you get them in as quick as you can is key, because you're competing against vacation and summertime. Lab, with lab services, evaluating what tests you're doing. Are they profitable tests? Are you sending too many tests out to reference labs? Are these tests that you can bring in-house for a reasonable price? Always worthwhile to evaluate. And also the pricing, are we competitive? I'll just say a few things, quick things about 340B. I think every hospital has experienced a decline in the net benefit of 340B, just given the changes from Medicare and how payers now are saying, well, it's a lower cost drug, so we base our reimbursement off of the cost of the drug, so we're going to pay less. But typically before this time, for every 10,000 provider-based clinic visits, you should expect about 400 to 450,000 in 340B net benefit. We're starting to see 340B under attack, so it's all the more reason to try to grow in other areas and departments.
And when Dan means, kind of we're seeing this decline just started in, a big part of the decline came in 2026 because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the government negotiating prices for 10 drugs. And that has created a lot of drugs that we were being profitable on through the 340B program. Now that profit has gone away.
It's really been a triple whammy, because not only with the decrease in Medicare, but I've seen where Walmart won't pay for any payers of those 10 drugs because they can't process the claims properly according to them. And then also with the lower cost of these drugs, payers who have their reimbursement tied to the cost of the drug are paying lower at all retail pharmacies as well. So I've seen facilities lose 40% of their net benefit already this year. So, um, talking about provider and practice management, I think we had a series earlier this week that really talked about rural health clinics and different provider designations. But, if you acquire a private practice in your community, you really want to, when you're acquiring that practice, consider what designations may be possible for that to increase your reimbursement. Sometimes depending on how the acquisition is, if it's a physical place or if it's just a practice, evaluate the reimbursement to make it a provider-based rural health clinic, or if you're moving it into the hospital, maybe just a provider-based entity. With work RVUs, it is, I have seen, including production in physician contracts, it seems like that is a really basic thing, but so often we go out to hospitals who have attached clinics and they're still paying a flat salary to the provider, and they wonder why they're only seeing maybe 12 or 15 patients a day. And you really have to build some incentives into the provider contracts to get them to align with the goals of the organization, the facility. Talking about
Also panel size and quality scores, right?
yes,
We want to set the physician's compensation with incentives around our organizational goals. And so best
and
practice physician comp have work RVUs, panel size, quality scores, etc.
I'll give you some examples of that in real life. Facility that I've been working with, they are in an ACO, and for every qualifying patient that is in the ACO, if a provider fills out this form, which helps performance in the ACO, we pay them a work RVU, one work RVU for filling out that form, because that's going to drive the shared savings in the accountable care organization and making sure that they're checking off those quality requirements for the ACO to generate shared savings. So we built that into their contract to really align the interests of the organization and the ACO with what the provider's comp is. Also, when it comes to providers, over communication is always great. So I try to do monthly work RVU reports and send it out to the provider. Of course, if they have any questions, I try to meet with them and talk to them about their work RVUs. Even if they're not on a production contract, I always send out their work RVU productions so they're aware where they're at.
What's interesting is often in our practices, and this is remember the organizational architecture where you have the three legs of decision rights, compensation, and measurement. I mean, I literally have had hospitals where they employ a number of physicians. They give the physicians almost 100% decision rights over their scheduling. They pay them a flat salary, and they give no information to manager performance. And they're wondering why the physicians and the advanced practice providers are seeing 10 patients a day. And so, this is a great, turn that around. Let's take a little bit back some of the control on the scheduling. Let's reward the providers around our organizational goals, production, quality, panel size, and then let's keep information in front of them so that they can manage themselves.
This is kind of a high level analysis we always like to do before we go on site to a client. And, up there in the upper right-hand corner, we have what we consider the 19,913 there. That is the primary service area population. And we tie that. We look at population, and then we look at all these different medical specialties and surgical specialties. And based on various studies, we estimate a range of how much of a need there is for a provider based off that population. And it's always interesting because, of course, when you go out to rural facilities, you see a lot of half FTEs of some sort of specialty, and maybe it's unrealistic to employ a provider of that nature. But if you can reach out to tertiary facilities to have them come, maybe once a month or a couple days a week to see patients, it always helps with your ancillary volume. And oftentimes, too, it's surprising to find that, hey, you know what, for our population that we have in our primary service area, we could employ a general surgeon or we could employ a full-time orthopedic surgeon. So this is just a good way, quick way to kind of get an idea of what the market in your area may demand.
So what this chart is saying is that given a population of essentially 20,000, there's three different studies that have been done over the last 20 years in our industry. And the low end of the study is this first column. The high end of those three studies is the second, this column my highlighters on. And so becomes the range given these three studies. We like to compare the range to the existing to identify where there's opportunities. And so, but frankly, it's a straight line. If you take your community's 10,000, all of these just get cut in half. So you can just take a look and see real quickly what this looks like. But I do want to point out one of the best practices that I've seen. I was actually just with this gentleman yesterday in Washington, D.C. They have a 10-year recruitment plan for their providers. And what that does, if you think about it, is it puts so they identify providers, physicians that are retiring, within 10 years. They'll back that up. That puts the recruitment process either in the high school or early college, and so it creates a tie-in to the local kids in the community. And so I really like this 5 to 10 recruitment plan.
Eric, I might say too, when it comes to physician recruitment, when you can get your own physicians to call up their buddies that they know that are also physicians, and tell them, hey, you know what, this is a great place to work. Maybe if you're dissatisfied at, a couple health systems over, a couple hospitals over, maybe there's an opportunity for you here. That carries so much weight, physician to physician recruiting. So getting your physicians aligned and to help you recruit other physicians is just a golden ticket.
When we've got about 12 slides to go in 12 minutes. So
All right.
we
Eric,
touched
do you want
on
to take this one?
Well, I think we've already touched on this was about getting the compensation right and just making sure that especially with our physicians that we want to have, we want to have them part of our team. And here I'm going to pull another three-legged stool of functional relationship, contractual relationship, and governance relationship. We want to have recognizing that we want to advance the relationship we have with all our providers. I think this is a big one. And this top bullet here, ensure third-party payers are allowing updated E&M work value units. This is important because I've been at several hospitals in the last couple months that they hadn't negotiated their third-party contracts, especially on the professional fee side, in years. And so what happened was back in 2021. The government changed the whole relative value system, which is where how we set our fees and how we get paid often. There was a significant increase in the work component of this relative value unit. It was about a 30% increase. And so what happened was the total relative value for this 99213, which is your bread and butter primary care evaluation and management code, the weighting went from 2.1 to 2.7, this huge increase. And so Medicare, the allowed amount in a physician fee schedule in a private practice went from about $60 to $90. And many of us are still getting paid at the $60 level from our commercial payers rather than having negotiated up to the new, I'm putting quotes around new, but the 2021 new weightings for our E&M codes, our evaluation and management codes. So I just wanted to touch on that one because I've run into that one now like 3 times in the last 2 months.
Absolutely.
And
hey, with point of service collections, you just got to do it. We got to hit on all the opportunities at this point in time.
It's often one of those that if you're not collecting the $10 when the patient presents in the clinic, you're not going to get it because it's going to be either written off to small balance or the cost to collect is greater than the actual amount and it gets written off. And frankly, if it's $100 visit and you don't collect $10, that's 10%. You add that up over thousands of times, that's a lot of money.
Yep. Quality performance improvement, I think some of this is a little bit rehashed different ways, but take a look at your HCAHPS scores. Make it a goal to have the highest patient satisfaction in your region within 12 months. And then if you achieve that, or you already have achieved that, don't keep it the best kept secret in town, in the area. It's okay. Brag a little bit about your patient satisfaction and your quality scores if you're doing a good job. Promote that in the public sphere. Eric, would you like to touch on anything here? Or
No,
a
this is
lot of
quality.
this is
It's not, no, just kidding.
it's a lot. It's very similar. You've got to make quality a strategic priority. Get there, promote it. When patients are happy, they'll tell their in-laws, they'll tell their family, they'll tell their friends, and it always drives more volume. So information technology, so often we think of IT as, boy, this is just big expense and burden on the facility. But we really need, at this point in time, with the push for population health initiatives and different things of that nature, we need to try to identify or think of IT as a real opportunity to harvest information and data and look for operational and efficiencies within our EMR and our IT system to make it more robust, of course, secure, and provide management with insights into what's going on in our EHR and what opportunities we may have. So,
Boy.
cost report. Here we go.
You know
So,
what?
yeah.
I think we should we'll leave these as a checklist.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
This is because it's going to put many of you to sleep if we get into cost reports and there's other I think there's other resources. We have cost
but
report
I
presentations.
think what we would say about the cost report, if you are a CAH, is, get some basic understandings, get some understand a few things within the cost report and things to look for so you can kind of ensure that your cost report is being prepared properly. Because if it's not, and you're a CAH, you might be, ideally you get cost-based reimbursement, but if it's not prepared properly and you're leaving money on the table, maybe you're getting a much less than your cost.
Yeah. The whole, yeah, this just becomes a checklist, making sure we have our labor delivery, that we're only capturing the time that the mom's in active labor versus the total stay. The one I'm seeing, I was at a hospital just recently in which bad debt. I mean, generally we like to see, especially on the outpatient side, between 10 and 20% of the Medicare responsive or the patient responsibility showing up as allowable bad debt. The hospital I was at recently, they were at 1%. And so there's an opportunity to flag improvement.
When it comes to revenue cycle, maintain a dashboard that looks at the results over time so you can see which way you're trending, not just week to week, but month to month and even maybe year to year to make sure you're trending in the right direction and address those issues. And when it comes to a revenue cycle committee, I actually like to have two. We have kind of a high level committee that involves, a wide range of department managers, including the practice manager and IT. So if there's something in IT that's preventing a revenue cycle from functioning properly, we can address it then. Or if there's a provider falling behind on their charts, we can schedule an administrative day for them to catch up on their charting. But then I like to have a more detailed committee where we get into more of the details, and that'll be with medical records and, of course, the business office and the CFO to really dig into more nuanced specific problems, maybe with payer denials, et cetera. So it's good to have a quick high level revenue cycle committee meeting so everyone can give their input of what might be impacting or slowing down the revenue cycle, and then kind of have a more detailed one.
Lots of
Um,
stuff here.
Lots of stuff with revenue cycle.
I,
Uh,
you the way I like to think about revenue cycle is that if we create a measurement culture, and as Dan just talked about KPIs, create a set of KPIs, track them over time, set goals and individuals responsible for, and use that as a basis for the weekly revenue cycle team meetings. That's number one. So KPI. The second thing is move all the effort to the front end. Pre-register all scheduled services, point of service cash collections wherever possible, have conversations about expected cash payments during the pre-registration process. So move all the effort to the front end. The last is increasingly we need a very sophisticated denial management system. And I've had hospitals just recently talk about how they're using AI to kind of to combat against some of the aggressiveness around denials that's going on right
and Eric, Amy Graham, our colleague, is going to do, I think next week, a detailed revenue cycle management
now. Right.
webinar as well. So she's going to jump into a lot more of this next week. Um, but management accounting, it really starts when we're talking about developing that picture, giving them decision rights. It also starts in the budgeting process, involving them, talking to them about their volumes, where can they grow, what their needs are, whether it be operational expenses or CapEx, and involving them in that process, and then providing them with P&L statements throughout the year to see how things are progressing with that plan. And we try to make it. I try to make it a little bit fun. We give out a little bit of awards for big spenders, that sort of thing, or stingy department managers. But involving them in that process really goes a long way, because most department managers almost never get to meet with the CFO when it comes to setting their budget.
So it's setting the budget, engaging the managers in both revenue, i.e. volume and expenses, and then monthly financial reporting, budget to actual, with required variance analysis, and quarterly, at a minimum, quarterly departmental operational reviews. To me, that is the key to creating that third-legged stool of measurement. It's the foundation. Staffing, let's see, boy, but we got about 2 minutes left, Dan. So uh, let me just say this quick. We look at staffing in the 400 hospitals that I worked with, cutting staff has been a recommendation probably 3 times. And we have been very successful in nearly every one of our hospitals in terms of a performing improvement, because when we have a department that's overstaffed, we have room to grow one more and not have to add staff. And that tends to be our recommendation. But these are the standards. So where the pointer is right now are the standards we look at. Your med-surg unit, we generally assume 12 paid hours. It's paid hours. In your emergency room, 2.75 paid hours. Here are the visits. And then we compare where the FTEs are standard to what you're doing. But again, it's never been a recommendation.
Real quickly on self-insured health plans, there's a lot that you can do with these plans. You want to pay attention to them. You want to build in, you want to encourage your employees to use your own services. Eric said it earlier, the study showed it, it's 10 cents on a dollar. When they leave your own hospital to get services outside of your domestic facility, that's a dollar for dollar cost. When they get the services there at your facility, you're looking at 10 cents on the dollar of cost. So build that into your health plan, put healthy incentives in there. Try to improve the health of your own employees. It's a good place to experiment.
And this is a really great graphic here around how to think about relationships with other organizations. And it's to be presented another day. And this is to be um, related to payment system transitions. I mean, again, this recognition that in today's current state, we got probably 2 minutes here. I think this is the last slide. That in today's era of sick care payment, there are incentives around healthcare, and such as annual wellness visits, annual physicals, well child visits. And what I encourage all organizations to start thinking about is I want them to start thinking about their community as people rather than patients. And patients implies a catcher mentality of sitting back, waiting for a sick patient to present, where people, your community as people, implies a more active outreach and expands the funnel into our system from narrow to very wide. And so,
And Eric, let me say one thing about the payment system transformation. You know, the facility I've just been working on the budget for, we have a population health department, and we credit them with chronic care management revenue, PCMH. They're getting the ACO revenue, and it turns out they're a revenue generating positive contribution department now. They're dropping about $15,000 a month to the bottom line through all those healthy incentives that their department is proactively doing, whether it be CCM, some quality incentives, things of that nature. So we have them as a department.
That's great. And the last area is just around population health and again, building the infrastructure for true healthcare in the future to meet the changing payment as it evolves slowly. One of the greatest opportunities, and Dan was just alluding to it, was around claims capability. Being able to shine a light on claims, one to reduce out-migration in your self-insured plan, but more importantly, reduce out-migration in your ACO, because again, we can provide a service 10 cents on the dollar versus if that service goes out of network. So lots of material here. It's tough in an hour. This is a 4-hour workshop at a minimum, and but appreciate all your patience. I don't know if this is the last one of the day. If anyone wants to stick around, we could answer a question or two. If Keith, you see any questions that
Yeah, there's a couple of questions if you want to go ahead
if
and answer them.
anybody that wants to bolt can we'll answer a couple, 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll wrap up here in another, like, say, 3 minutes.
All right. So question, if a hospital has a mix of contracted and non-contracted ED providers, how should they handle standby tracking?
Well, it really comes down to, so here, my opinion, then Dan, you can, is it if if the physicians are billing their own pro fees, then 100% of what we're paying should be standby. If we're billing the physician method 2 of a critical access hospital or otherwise, if we're billing, then every physician, whether they're contracted or not, should be tracking their time. I mean, we increasingly, there's things like electronic tracking through like a Versa badge or somebody like that is super helpful. But detailed time tracking, and what we find is the more accurate your time tracking is, the better reimbursements you're going to have. We generally shoot for you. There's a math you can do. Assume 25 minutes or so of professional time for ER visit. Right. So if you actually go in and take the portion of time during the year that is in professional capacity, divide it by 25 minutes, and figure out, how many, or actually divide it by your emergency room visits, find out how many minutes of professional time the cost report's telling you, and compare it to that 25. Many hospitals that aren't paying attention to this, that number is 45, 50, 60 minutes of professional time, meaning that they're losing out on 50% of ER compensation eligible for cost-based reimbursement.
Dan, any
Yeah,
comment on that?
I think that covers it.
yeah.
All right. Another question. Have you done any work on direct-to-employer arrangements? We are looking at this as a strategy to capture more of our local market, but we would love to talk with someone who has had some success with a small community.
There was a hospital I worked with in Louisiana that had created a direct-to-market with their local college in town around charging a PMPM for access to primary care. I was just speaking with a CEO yesterday in Washington of a critical access hospital that had reached out to this hospital in Louisiana, and they're looking to do it with some of their large employers in town. But this is one of those, what I've found, this is one of those slowly emerging fields of interest of the critical access hospitals. Dan, are you guys doing any of that at the hospital you're
Yeah,
at?
there's a large manufacturing facility just down the road that we use something similar. We have a direct contract with them for various services that we offer here, and they just we bill it to them, and then they pay us. So there are some different, when you're cutting out all the middlemen, so to speak, you can actually get a little more aggressive on some of the pricing that you offer.
So reach out to Dan, and Dan can help fill in you and the details. Next.
What separates an abundance mindset from the others, and how does that mindset positively affect financials?
Wow.
There's a
So
softball for you, Eric.
yeah, please, please. So what I've found in my travels is that scarcity tends to be very expense focused, and where abundance tends to be very growth oriented, focusing on that one more. And those are kind of the characteristics that I see in those two different mindsets. It's like the abundance is we can, and the scarcity is why do we want to? And so I'm not sure. Boy, this is one of those, grab a beer and we could sit down and talk for 2 hours on this topic. It's just
You
really,
know, I would say, Eric, what I see with financials is when somebody has that abundance mindset over the course of maybe a year, maybe 2 years, you see the financials all of a sudden start to just go up and just growth emerge. Versus if you have a scarcity mindset, sure, maybe in the short run, you see some boost in the financial performance, but there's been a lack of investment. And that sort of scarcity mindset uh, pushes down to the department managers to where that pitcher starts to turn into a catcher. And so I think, when you start to look more over the mid-range and long term is when you start to see the difference between the abundance mindset and scarcity mindset.
yeah. I'll just give an example. Dan and I were actually called into a hospital back in 2019. We got called in by under a program through USDA and RHA to help this hospital because it was identified it had a USDA outstanding loan, and they were identified as a troubled hospital. Financial, they were losing money. And when we arrived, shortly before we arrived, a new CEO came in that I now consider top three abundant leader I know in the United States. They went from being on the USDA watch list to, I pulled up his cost report for 2025. They had a 22%, or excuse me, they had a $22 million bottom line on $110 million of patient revenue. And Dan, I didn't tell you that, but I mean, it is absolutely remarkable how powerful abundance is. This gentleman has no more room on his medical staff for providers or physicians. There's just no more room. They have a wait list of doctors that want to come work for the organization. That is the essence of abundance.
Yeah.
Maybe
When physicians when
maybe one
physicians
more.
are when physicians are calling your organization asking if they can come work for you, that's when you know you've started to achieve that abundance mindset.
All
And
right. Well,
just one more comment. Jeez, gosh, this thing. I know when I'm in the company of somebody abundant minded, when I want to give them an extra 10%. I want to give them everything I got plus 10%. I know when I'm not in the company of an abundance person, when I'm kind of going through the motions. And that's a real litmus test to see if you are with someone that's abundance or scarcity based. All right, one last question, Keith, and then we'll wrap up.
all right. At what cost per work RVU does it make more financial sense for a hospital to outsource radiology to a teleradiology group rather than maintain an employed model?
Boy, boy.
I've seen more and more where you're just having to bill the professional fee for imaging yourself because there's just such a stronghold with these radiology groups. So
And take
we've
a loss, right, Dan? And take a loss.
yeah, and take a loss. They just would rather know exactly how much money they're going to get in, or currently for us, they basically charge us a little bit more than what they would get if they build it professionally, and you just kind of have to take it, unfortunately. Uh, Not a real great solution for that, but the supply and demand has sort of dictated it in the
Yeah,
market.
we're finding that in radiology and CRNAs.
CRNAs, yeah.
It's just starting to dictate market. So,
It's
hey, look, hey, thanks all of you that stuck around. Thanks for all of you that were listening. Maybe someday we do a workshop on this topic, and it's really fun when we can get all of you participating in this discussion, because that's when the magic happens. So, appreciate you guys, and I got to head down to
yeah.
Massachusetts here, so I got to hit the road.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much, everybody, for staying with you. Just when you close out of today's session, there's going to be a brief pop-up. We really appreciate your feedback. We hope you'll join us again next week as we continue sharing these strategies and real-world insights, and for strengthening the organizations and the communities that we serve. So thank you very much for joining us. As always, feel free to reach out to our team with any questions, and we hope to see you next week.
Bye.